The war had been a century in the making, a conflict designed to be flawless in execution, precise in its brutality. The enemy had studied every detail, every tactic, every strategy, and perfected their military doctrine over countless generations. For them, victory was a given, an inevitability etched into the very fabric of their society. It was a doctrine forged by the finest minds, tested in battle across countless systems, and refined through the ashes of worlds they had conquered. There was no room for error in their plans. They believed that they were invincible, that their strategy would crush any force that dared stand in their way. But all of it, everything they had worked for, crumbled within a day. One human, one single soldier, had shattered their perfect war doctrine with nothing more than ingenuity, grit, and the relentless human spirit. No matter how much they had studied us, no matter how carefully they thought they had accounted for every possibility, they had missed one thing. They underestimated our capacity to adapt, to think outside the box when every rule they followed said there was no other way. It wasn't just a matter of winning a battle. It was a seismic shift that rattled the very core of their military superiority. For centuries, they had considered us inferior, primitive even. They had seen us as a species that fought with crude weapons and irrational impulses, easily swept aside by precision and technology. They believed they could control everything, every variable, every outcome because they had the foresight to plan for all contingencies. But in a single, unpredictable act, one human had turned their flawless doctrine into dust. The battlefield that day wasn't one of grand armies clashing in the traditional sense. It was a clash of minds. The enemy had expected a clean, organized engagement. They thought we would follow their rules, play into their hands. But what they never anticipated was that the human mind could evolve so quickly, so dangerously. They couldn't foresee that one soldier, equipped with only a fraction of the technology they wielded, could outthink them at every turn. It wasn't brute force that won the day, it was the ability to see things from a perspective they couldn't even begin to comprehend. This wasn't just a victory. It was an awakening, a moment that shattered the myth of their unassailable power. And yet, as the dust settled, there were no celebrations. There was no sense of triumph. In fact, the victory left a sense of dread hanging in the air, dread not just for the enemy, but for us as well. If one human could defeat their grand design so effortlessly, what would that mean for the future? Were we ready to face the consequences of such a monumental shift? Could we, too, become the architects of our own downfall? But the biggest question lingered in the air. What had the enemy learned from that day? Had they really understood their mistake, or were they simply recalibrating, determined to make the next conflict their final, decisive victory? And how would they respond when the full weight of their fury was brought down upon us? The answer, though, would take more than just a day to uncover. And as the human soldier, who had unknowingly become the focal point of this new war, stared out at the vast, uncertain horizon, one thing was certain: the next stage of this conflict would not be fought in the same way. Neither side could afford to fight the same war twice. They had learned too much, and so had we. The enemy's war doctrine had been centuries in the making, meticulously crafted and relentlessly perfected over countless generations. They had mastered the art of conflict, honed their tactics to a razor's edge, and believed that nothing could stand in their way. Their strategy was built upon a foundation of absolute control over the battlefield, over their soldiers, and over the narrative of war itself. They had crushed entire civilizations beneath the weight of their precision, leaving nothing behind but ruin. They were cold, calculated, and they never lost. Until that day. It started with a small group of them, a specialized force designed to test the mettle of human resistance. They had been studying humanity for decades, cataloging our weaknesses and looking for patterns that could be exploited. They believed that, like so many before us, we could be predicted, easily manipulated, and ultimately dominated. They saw our unpredictability as a flaw, a weakness to be eliminated, and their first strike was supposed to be the beginning of the end. But then, they encountered something they hadn't planned for. The human soldier, the one who had unwittingly become the thorn in their side, wasn't part of any grand strategy. He wasn't a general, or even a trained officer. He was just someone with an incredible sense of survival, a sharp mind, and an unyielding will to fight. It was the sort of resourcefulness that couldn't be taught in any academy, the sort of ingenuity that no amount of preparation could account for. He had been thrown into the chaos of war without much more than basic training, a few weapons, and a determination to protect those around him. In a battle that should have been a decisive defeat for humanity, he turned the tide. With nothing but his wits, he infiltrated their command center and unleashed a series of moves that disrupted their entire war machine. He exploited their most basic flaw, their overconfidence. They had believed themselves too advanced, too prepared, to be outsmarted by anything so simple as human tenacity. But when their calculations went awry, when the perfect system they had built crumbled in an instant, it left them reeling. The victory, however, was more than just an isolated skirmish. It sent ripples through their ranks, and word of it spread faster than anyone could have imagined. They had underestimated us for so long, dismissing us as little more than pawns in their grand design. Now, they were faced with the reality that one human had not only survived, but had single-handedly undone years of effort and planning. What did that mean for their entire military infrastructure? What did it mean for their understanding of war? As the war raged on, the higher-ups in their command structure scrambled to reassess their position. They couldn't afford another defeat like that, especially not after everything they had sacrificed to get this far. But the questions they were asking themselves were more troubling than they realized. How could they predict a species that had just defied their every expectation? How could they account for the human spirit, something they hadn't even considered when developing their doctrine? And more importantly, how could they ensure that no other human, no single individual, could do the same again? Meanwhile, on the human side, the soldiers were left to pick up the pieces of a war that had been turned upside down. The victory had sparked a wave of hope, but also a gnawing fear. What did we really know about the enemy? What had they learned from their failure, and what were they planning in response? The victory, while monumental, had only uncovered more questions than answers. In the aftermath, the human soldier who had played such a pivotal role in the disruption of the enemy's plans was left to wrestle with his newfound importance. He had never asked to be a hero, never sought out the glory that had come with his actions. He was just trying to survive, to protect those he loved. But the eyes of the world were now on him, and the weight of that attention was more than he had ever imagined. Every move he made, every decision he took, was now under the microscope of military leaders and civilians alike. It was a position he hadn't asked for, yet he could feel the burden of it growing heavier each day. The enemy, however, was not about to let him rest. They had learned from their failure, and they were preparing to strike back, harder and faster than before. In the shadows of the war, new alliances were forming, and old ones were being tested. Humanity's unexpected victory had sparked something within the ranks of other civilizations watching from afar. Some saw it as an opportunity, a chance to rise up and challenge the enemy who had once seemed unbeatable. Others, however, remained wary, uncertain whether humanity could maintain the momentum or whether the enemy would wipe us out entirely in retaliation. As alliances shifted and military strategies were reworked, one thing became clear: the war was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. In the distance, enemy commanders were meeting, discussing their next move. They had learned from their defeat, yes, but there were whispers of something even more dangerous in the works. A new weapon, a new strategy, something that could obliterate humanity before it even had a chance to regroup. The thought of another loss was unthinkable to them. They would not let it happen again. The question that hung in the air was this: could humanity, with all its newfound resolve, stand against a force that had spent centuries perfecting the art of war? Or was this victory nothing more than a temporary glitch in an otherwise unstoppable machine? The tension in the air grew palpable as both sides began to regroup. For humanity, the victory had been a spark igniting hope in the hearts of soldiers and civilians alike. But in the wake of their unexpected triumph, the reality began to settle in. The war was far from over. In fact, the enemy was now more dangerous than ever. Every strategy, every plan they had once relied upon had been disrupted, forcing them to rethink their entire approach to warfare. They were adapting. And that was the one thing humanity had not fully accounted for. The enemy's response came in waves, each more calculated than the last. They had drawn from their ancient doctrines, incorporating new technology, new tactics, and even psychological warfare into their arsenal. Their greatest asset, however, was their intelligence. They had spies everywhere within our own ranks, within our systems. Every move humanity made was being watched. But what the enemy didn't expect was that their overconfidence, the very thing that had led to their downfall, would blind them to the truth hiding right under their noses. Unknown to their commanders, one of their most trusted officers had been in secret contact with human resistance cells. This officer, once a staunch believer in the enemy's superiority, had begun to question the wisdom of their methods after the disastrous defeat. He had seen firsthand the unpredictability of humans, the very thing that had cost them so dearly. His growing disillusionment with the regime had led him to take a massive risk, leaking vital information to the human side, hoping to shift the course of the war. But his actions came with great peril. If the enemy discovered his betrayal, it would be a death sentence not just for him, but for everyone he had helped. Meanwhile, on the human side, the soldier who had single-handedly crippled the enemy's war efforts was beginning to unravel. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become a symbol of hope, a figure that the public looked to for strength. But the weight of that expectation was crushing. Every decision he made now had global consequences, and the pressure was starting to take its toll. His nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by the faces of the fallen, by the victories that seemed increasingly hollow in the face of an enemy that would not relent. He had no illusions anymore. The war wasn't about victory, it was about survival. And he could feel the enemy closing in, learning from their mistakes, refining their approach. It wouldn't be long before they launched their next offensive, one that would test humanity's resolve in ways they hadn't yet imagined. As the days stretched on, a sense of unease began to creep through the ranks. There were whispers of a new weapon, one that the enemy had kept hidden until now. Intelligence reports were fragmented, but they spoke of something terrifying, something that could wipe out entire cities in the blink of an eye. Humanity had faced its fair share of challenges, but this was different. This wasn't a battle fought with guns and tanks. It was a war against something far more insidious. Then came the message, a broadcast intercepted by human forces. It was brief, disturbingly so. The enemy's high command had issued a chilling statement. They were done playing games. They were shifting their focus, not just on the battlefield, but on something much more personal. They had tracked down the human soldier who had disrupted their plans, and they were preparing a trap that would draw him out. The message ended with one simple phrase, "We will make you wish you had never won." The stakes had just been raised. It wasn't enough to win a battle anymore. Now, they were coming for the very soul of humanity. The human soldier, already reeling from the pressure, knew what this meant. The enemy had adapted. They were targeting him, making him the centerpiece of their new strategy. He had become the symbol of everything they feared. But there was a darker layer to this, something even he couldn't yet see. The twist in the enemy's strategy was far more subtle than anyone had imagined. They weren't just coming for him. They were using him as bait, not just for a physical trap, but for something deeper, something psychological. Unbeknownst to the human soldier, the officer on the enemy's side had been working in secret, feeding misinformation to both sides. He had planted the idea that the human soldier's victory was not a fluke, that it was the result of something much more sinister. In doing so, he had set the stage for a conflict that would not only tear apart the military structures of both sides, but would also divide the human forces themselves. The more the human soldier was held up as a hero, the more the cracks began to show. Factions within humanity began to question whether the price of this victory was too high. The enemy knew exactly how to exploit that division. And then came the twist, the real shock. The officer who had betrayed his people, the one who had fed humanity false hope, had been working for a shadow faction within the enemy ranks. His loyalty was not to the greater war effort, but to an even older, more dangerous ideology that sought to transform humanity, not destroy it. This hidden faction believed that humanity's victory was not a mistake, it was a sign that the enemy had been wrong all along. They believed that humanity was the key to something greater, something they could never achieve without our help. But their methods were radical. They wanted to manipulate humanity into a form they could control an army, not just for the enemy, but for an even darker purpose. The moment of realization hit hard. The war wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control. And humanity, every soldier, every civilian, was caught in the middle of a deadly game that no one fully understood. As the enemy's trap tightened and the human soldier prepared for his next move, he had no idea that the true enemy was not just the forces in front of him, but the ones manipulating the war from within. And with every move he made, he was drawing closer to a truth that could shatter everything he thought he knew about the war, about the enemy, and about humanity itself. The battlefield had changed, and now no one was safe. The trap was set. The enemy's high command had made their move, and the human soldier, unaware of the full scale of the web being spun around him, was drawn into the heart of their scheme. For weeks, the tension had built, with each passing day feeling like a countdown to something inevitable. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. As he prepared to lead his forces into what seemed like a standard offensive, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The enemy's movements were too predictable, too precise. They were acting like they wanted him to engage them. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to pull back, but the stakes of the war of humanity's survival pushed him forward. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubt, he led his team into the most dangerous battle yet. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a stage for something far more insidious. The enemy had set up the perfect ambush. Their forces were overwhelming, and the human soldier found himself cornered, trapped with his team in a desolate wasteland, their only escape sealed off by the enemy's most advanced weaponry. It was a moment that felt like the end, like the culmination of everything they had worked toward. But as the enemy closed in, something unexpected happened. The soldier's sharp mind, honed by the brutality of the war and the lessons learned from his previous victory, recognized the pattern in the enemy's strategy. The perfect trap they had laid wasn't meant to kill him, it was meant to isolate him. They wanted him alone, in one place, so they could manipulate him into making the ultimate choice. What they hadn't anticipated was that, in the heat of battle, the human soldier wasn't alone, not anymore. As the walls seemed to close in, an unexpected ally emerged. The officer who had betrayed his own people, the one who had been feeding false hope to humanity, was in the midst of the enemy's ranks, but not as a loyal servant. He had switched sides once again, secretly aligning with a faction within the enemy that believed humanity's victory was not a mistake, but a necessity. He had been manipulating both sides all along, feeding humanity just enough information to give them hope, and feeding the enemy just enough false intelligence to keep them from discovering the truth. In that moment of chaos, the human soldier made a choice. He didn't fight just to survive. He fought to expose the truth. With the help of his unexpected ally, they infiltrated the enemy's command center and uncovered the dark truth about the real puppet masters pulling the strings. The true enemy wasn't the one standing across the battlefield. It was the shadow faction within the enemy's ranks that had been manipulating both sides for their own twisted agenda. They weren't interested in domination. They wanted to destroy everything, both human and enemy alike, and start anew, reshaping the universe in their image. It was a revelation that shocked both sides. The final twist was not in the victory of one species over another, but in the realization that the war had been orchestrated by forces beyond their comprehension. The battle they had fought, the lives they had lost, had all been part of a much larger game. And the human soldier, with his ally by his side, was now in a position to do the one thing no one had expected, to end the war not with more bloodshed, but with the truth. The final confrontation was a desperate race against time. The enemy's plans to unleash their ultimate weapon were already in motion, and humanity's forces were scrambling to stop it. But the human soldier had a final card to play, one last act of defiance. He reached deep into the heart of the enemy's command center, activating a fail-safe that had been hidden in plain sight, a set of codes, long forgotten by the higher-ups, that would take down the entire enemy network. It wasn't just about disabling their weapon. It was about dismantling the very system that had held their forces together for centuries. As the code executed, the entire enemy operation began to unravel. Systems went dark, communications cut out, and their once invincible military infrastructure collapsed from within. It wasn't a victory built on firepower or strategy, it was a victory built on knowledge and truth. The human soldier, with the help of his ally, had used the enemy's own technology against them, not through brute force, but through sheer will and cunning. In the aftermath, the war ended not with a bang, but with the silence of a broken system. The enemy's forces scattered, their unity shattered by the very thing that had made them so dangerous, their arrogance. The puppet masters within their ranks, the ones who had orchestrated the conflict, were exposed and dealt with by both sides, ensuring that no further manipulation could take place. Humanity had not only survived the war, but had emerged from it stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. But there was a lingering question, one that remained unanswered as the dust settled. What had driven the shadow faction within the enemy's ranks to such extremes? What had they hoped to achieve by orchestrating a war that threatened to destroy everything? And, most importantly, what would happen next? As humanity began to rebuild and heal from the scars of war, the shadow of that question loomed large, a reminder that, while the war may have ended, the true fight for the future had only just begun. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't the battle won or the enemy defeated. It was the revelation that humanity, with all its flaws and weaknesses, had the ability to outthink, outlast, and ultimately outmaneuver the most advanced forces in the universe. The war had been a test of endurance, of spirit, and of the unbreakable will of the human race. And in the end, it was that will that had won the day.